Hello and welcome back to LPRs Delivery. Today's lesson will be looking at the exciting topic of phrasal verbs, which is one of the most confusing things for people learning English as a second language. So to get started, a phrasal verb is basically just a phrase that contains a verb and a preposition or adverb or both, and the meaning of which is different from the meaning of its separate parts. So for example, work out would be different from work, and it's different from out. Let's get started with some aviation phrasal verbs. So for example, take off, I'm sure everyone knows. Pilots must get clearance from ATC before they can take off. Again, take off is the verb here, which means to become airborne. So this is actually the verb. One thing to notice is pronunciation with phrasal verbs. We think about the rhythm or the stress. Pilots must get clearance from ATC before they can take off. So the thing to notice is that in the phrasal verb, we almost always stress the second word, which may be opposite to what you usually think about prepositions or particles like this. This is the opposite from what we've talked about before with compound nouns like takeoff. So takeoff can also be a noun. So for example here, pilots must get clearance from ATC before they can take off. We could also say before takeoff. Notice the difference here that we've got they can take off and take off. So in this case we've got a full clause, so they is our subject and can take off would be the verb phrase. Whereas here, it's just a noun, because here we have the preposition before, so we've got before takeoff. So the thing to notice is that the stress is different. If we're referring to a noun, it's take off, but if we're referring to it as a phrasal verb, take off. You see the difference. Another example is the compound noun touchdown. So pilots must vacate the runway immediately after touchdown. So the same idea here, we've got after, which is our preposition, and then we've got the noun touchdown, immediately after touchdown. However, we could also use the phrasal verb touch down after they touch down. So again, we see the difference in pronunciation. Now let's look at some more aviation-related phrasal verbs. It's important to follow the latest developments in aviation technology, or it's important to stay current with the latest developments. So what phrasal verb could we have here? Keep up with. All right, so it's important to keep up with the latest developments in aviation technology. Next, when I became a watch supervisor, I had to accept a lot more responsibility, or receive a lot more responsibility, get a lot more responsibility. So what phrasal verb can we put here? Take on. I had to take on a lot more responsibility. Next, commercial aircraft tires become no longer in good condition after about 200 to 300 landings. So what's that phrasal verb, which means to become unusable? Wear out. Right, so commercial aircraft tires wear out after about 200 to 300 landings. After I arrive, the first thing I do is examine the notum, or review the notum, or read the notum. So what phrasal verb could we use here? Go over the notum. Right, so the first thing I do is go over the notum. After a crash, investigators will investigate the cause of the incident, or research the cause of the incident. So here we could say, look into, right? So investigators will look into the cause of the incident. Next, VIP flights often delay traffic. You may remember from the lesson on traffic what phrasal verb means delay. Hold up, right? VIP flights often hold up traffic. Next, if you procrastinate or if you delay studying for the IKO English exam till the last minute, you might fail. So what's a phrasal verb for procrastinate? Put off. If you put off studying for the IKO exam. Next, the firefighters are trying to extinguish the fire. So what's the phrasal verb that means extinguish? Put out. To put out. The firefighters are trying to put out the fire. Next, we have to turn off engine number 2, or we have to deactivate engine number 2. I'm sure everyone knows that this is shut down. However, an interesting thing about the word shut down is that we can use it transitively, or in a transitive sense, so you can shut down something. Right? The pilots shut down the engine. Or we can also use this in an intransitive sense. Engine number 2 has just shut down. In this case, we're not saying shut down anything. It just shut down by itself. So we can use shut down as an action from the pilot, or shut down as in what happens to the engine. Next, could you work in my position for 5 minutes? Or could you replace me for 5 minutes? I need to go to the bathroom. So we could also say, could you take over? Yeah, so could you take over for 5 minutes? Now, just like before when we talked about shut down something or shut down, take over is the same. Could you take over something? No, not necessarily. It just means replace me or work in my position. This would be in what we call, again, the intransitive sense. But take over can also be transitive. Could you take over my position? So we can also take over something. Could you take over my position for 5 minutes? So for this word, we can do both. That brings me to the next point about phrasal verbs. And this has to do with grammar. That we have 2 types of phrasal verbs. Actually, there are many types of phrasal verbs, but we can just look at these 2 types. That is a way to classify them. First, we have separable phrasal verbs. As you can probably see, separable means that we can separate, so able to separate. So some transitive phrasal verbs we can separate. So for example, if we say, you shouldn't put off. Put off is a transitive phrasal verb. So if you see this, you would probably be thinking, put off what? Put off what? Because it doesn't make sense to just say put off. We must have an object. For example, you shouldn't put off saving for retirement. Here, saving for retirement is the object of the phrasal verb put off. So that's what we mean by transitive. So the point is that we can separate the phrasal verb with the object. You shouldn't put saving for retirement off. So this may sound a little bit strange, but it's grammatically possible. And sometimes we do this with separable phrasal verbs. Now, note that we don't have to separate it. Put off saving for retirement is just fine. We don't have to separate it, but we can. However, in this situation, saving for retirement is important. You shouldn't put off it. So maybe you're thinking about it as a pronoun to refer to saving for retirement. In this case, though, we're not allowed to do this. Because put off is a separable phrasal verb, if we use the pronoun, we must put the pronoun between the two parts of the phrasal verb. So again, put off it cannot, not allowed to do this. So we must put it between. You shouldn't put it off. Now, next we'll talk about inseparable phrasal verbs, which obviously means verbs which cannot be separated. So all intransitive phrasal verbs we can think of as inseparable. So for example, in 10 minutes, the plane will take off. Take off something? No, it's not taking off anything, it's just take off. So intransitive. Likewise, the aircraft has just touched down. Has just touched down something? No. It's just touched down. It's by itself, it has complete meaning already. So all intransitive phrasal verbs like these, you don't need to worry about separating. However, like we said before, some transitive phrasal verbs, like put off, are separable. But some transitive phrasal verbs are also inseparable. For example, some phrasal verbs, the second word functions as a preposition as opposed to an adverb. And in these cases, it's an inseparable transitive verb. So for example, the police are looking into the situation now. So we remember that look into means investigate. So again, this is transitive because you have to look into something. So the situation is the object. In this case, we can say, the police are looking into it now. But if we try to put it in the middle, the police are looking it into now, we cannot. We're not allowed to do this with this type of phrasal verb because, as we've said before, it's inseparable. We cannot separate the two parts. Another example. First, we'll go over the new procedures. So go over is the phrasal verb, which means to read or review. And we would say first we'll go over them, or first we'll go over the new procedures. So again, we are not allowed to separate this phrasal verb because it's just inseparable. Now, this may start to confuse you a bit because how do you know the difference between separable and inseparable phrasal verbs? And it is a difficult question, and the best way to do it is to make notes in your vocabulary notebook whenever you're learning new words. Learner's dictionaries, like a Cambridge Learner Dictionary or Oxford Learner's Dictionary, will give you good examples, and they'll often even say, put something off. In this case, you'll know that it's separable. And that's it for today's lesson on phrasal verbs. I'd recommend that you go back at the video and write down all the phrasal verbs that we talked about in this lesson, and then go online to either Oxford or Cambridge Learner's Dictionaries and look at all the examples about how to use these phrasal verbs. That can help you to remember them. Also, be careful that some phrasal verbs have multiple meanings, so please be careful about that as well. And that's it for today's lesson, and see you next time on LPR's Delivery. ขอบคุณครับ สวัสดีครับ